Do you remember as a kid getting to play these things? You remember those, to connect the dots? And some of them were a little bit more complicated than this one was, and you just look and it was a bunch of dots and stuff, and you say, well, what is that? And you would start connecting those and those things, and it would, before you knew it, it turned into something. A picture would emerge from that. And I do remember that I loved doing those as a kid. We're in our final week of our series that we've called Fill in the Blank. And the purpose of this this series was to help us move from generally speaking about some things to being very specific about some things that we want to do. For instance, we don't want to be people who say, well, we're going to pray for those who are sick. Well, who are the sick people? Let's name them. Let's fill in the blank with some people we're going to pray for that are sick. We say, let's pray for those who are hurting. Who are they? Let's put some names in the blank. So we'll pray specifically. Pray for the lost. All of these things, people who are struggling, we're going to put names in the blank. And when another week we talked about that we say we're going to reach out as a church. Well, who are we going to reach out to? Let's put some names in the blanks of people we're going to reach out to, whether it's in family, co-workers, friends, people you just barely know. How are we going to do that? Let's put some names in. And then last week we talked about one that we're going to fill in the blank with some names of some people that we're going to try to challenge. And we determined this, the first name. If we're not going to be hypocritical about this, the first name that has to go in there is ours, our own name. To challenge those of us who are already Christians to live up to our faith, to walk with the commitment that we promised Christ that we would when we became Christians. Challenge us, the followers of Christ, to stand up and be counted. But we also said we want to challenge the lost with the way Jesus did, with grace and with truth. And so we want to put some names in those places, in those blanks, of how we can do that. Well, so now we come, and this is where we are now. We're at the end of this series, and it's time to, if you might say, connect the dots. What we've been talking about for several weeks here, now let's draw some lines. Let's connect the dots so we can see some things begin to happen. We're praying for these people. We're reaching out to these people. We're challenging them with whatever way we need to, the way Christ would. Now let's see some things begin to happen. And we have the perfect passage of Scripture today to look at that, to see what happens as you connect the dots. When we do our part and then Christ does his. And now as you're turning to Romans chapter 10, because that's primarily where I'm going to spend all of my time today, as you're turning to Romans chapter 10, let me give you a little bit of the background of what's happening here. Paul is writing to the church at Rome. And in this writing here, he's at this little section, he's talking about how what a tragedy it was that the Israelites did not respond to Christ. That when Jesus came, they basically rejected him. And Paul is saying, you don't want to make the same mistakes. He says, Christ came to save all people, Jew and Gentile. But you don't want to make the same mistakes. And so he goes into a section, he's talking about how important it is to, in a sense, connect the dots to make sure that all people know about Christ. And this is what he comes up with, how to make sure that no one misses the opportunity. Romans chapter 10, verse 13 says this, and that shows you it's a kind of a moving from what he's been talking about. He's making a conclusion here. He says, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. This is a major theme of the New Testament, of Jesus' teaching, of Paul's preaching. Salvation is for everyone. But Paul is about to point out that this great news, but it is great news, but you have to know about it. You have to hear this great news. It's like being sick with a terrible disease, and then laid into it, you find out, well, there's been a cure for it all along. And you go, oh, why didn't I know about it? Well, nobody told you. Or you find out, then you say, well, now that I know, I want to make sure everybody else in my family who's sick as well. finds out about this cure. And that's what he's talking about. So we are to have a desperation, we're going to see, to make sure that everybody gets to hear about this. So look at verse 14. It says this, how then can they call on, so this is a continuation. He says, Christ came, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But then he goes on, he says, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? Verse 15, and how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. You know, when someone usually implies or says this, well, he or she, they're a little backwards about the way they think. That's usually not a compliment, is it? We usually don't take that as a compliment. But this is exactly what Paul does here. And sometimes that's exactly what we need to do. We need to go to the end result and go backwards. Work our way back. Say, well, how did we get to this point? You know, he says, Christ, anyone that calls on the name of Christ will be saved. And so Paul chooses to make a great argument here, presenting the truth by going back and working from the conclusion all the way back. And we're going to see all the things it takes place to end up with a completed picture. Think of it this way. I feel like just about everybody here today has seen a baptism. Maybe in a river, maybe in a swimming pool, maybe right here in our own baptismal right here. Have you ever, when you saw that baptism took place? You know, in a sense, that is the beginning of a new life. When they go down in the water and they come back up, it's the beginning. But it's also the conclusion of a series of events and decisions. It is the end. It's the culmination of a lot of things that's happened. And if we look at someone being baptized, think about what got them to that point. What got them to that place where they are being baptized? That's what we're going to do here. We're going to work backwards a little bit. So we'll just move backwards. Picture that baptism in your mind. Well, let's move backwards from there. And so I want to ask some logical questions that really Paul was asking when you read these three verses. And the first one is this. Will you go? Will you go? Let me reread verses 14, part of 14 and 15. And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Here, when it talks about preaching or preach, the word is actually to herald, to proclaim, to tell. So if you were sitting here and go, this is saved for those professional guys, those professional preachers to do. No, this had nothing to do with that. This was talking about those who can herald, those who can proclaim, those who can tell about Christ. He's talking about. It's for all Christians. Well, then you might sit here and say, well, how do I know I have been sent? Because it says you have to be sent. Matthew 28, 18 through 20. And you might be tired of hearing that read, but I'll never get tired of reading it. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the end of the age. Jesus said that the very last portion, very last words he said on this earth. That was our marching orders. We have been sent. And when it says, therefore go, that you've probably heard this before, that means, the Greek means as you're going, as you go about your business, as you go to work, as you go to school, as you go out to eat, as you're walking, as you're talking, wherever you go, it's with the intent of how can I do something that will make a disciple for Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, and he's talking about how important it is to proclaim Christ and to be made right with God again. He calls it to be reconciled. He says, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. In other words, be made right. Accept this. Come, accept this gospel that we're talking about. Be made right. He's saying, Christ wants us to tell you this. So we have been sent. We have been sent. Now, most of us have a routine, don't we? Most of us have a routine. I could have walked in here today, and you could have done it too, and I could have had a blindfold on. And I could have said, well, I know where you're sitting, and I know where you're sitting because you always sit there, and I know where you're at over here. Isn't that true? You're smiling because don't you come in and find your spot? We are so routine-oriented. I can close my eyes and see my mom sitting in church. You know why? Because she sat in the same place every Sunday that I can ever remember. We are routine people. We know what we like to do. We know where we like to eat. We know where we like to play. We have jobs we go to. We go to the same schools. What Jesus and Paul are saying is simply use the avenues that you're already going to interact with people with the intent, with the thought that I can do something that will possibly lead to them becoming a disciple. Now, to do that, even though it's a routine and it's something we do all the time, to do that, we have to come out of our comfort zones. Now, notice I did not say we have to come out of our time zones. I didn't say we have to come out of our zip codes. Now, Christ may call you to a different time zone. He may call you to a different zip code. But as you go, he says, just come out of the comfort zone. And if you haven't been doing that, that's your challenge here. It's just to get out of that routine. Do you eat out? Yes. Do you have a waitress or waiter? Yes. One of the neatest things that I know of some guys who do it, and I've tried to start doing it more, is when they go to the same restaurant, they will strike up conversations with the waitress, maybe the same one they'll have every time. And then they'll be at the end, they'll go, is there something I can pray about for you? Just something going on in your family, something I can pray about? And you'll be amazed at the inroads that opens up for people. That somebody just wants to simply pray for them. And how doors are open there. Do you shop at the same places? I know you do. We shop. Does the same person wait on you a lot? The same person? Janice told me this yesterday. There's one lady that waits on her a lot at Walmart, and this tells you how much she goes to Walmart. And she complimented her yesterday, and she says, you are the nicest person, and you always are so nice checking me out, helping me out at Walmart. So Janice went and bought her a candy bar, big candy bar, came back later just to give it to her, and she wasn't there. So we ate it. But the thought, that thought there, that thought that, here's just a lady who comes in and says, hey, you're one of the nicest employees I run into. And then just to go back by and give her a gift. She'll end up catching her there sometime, giving her something else. But those are just little things like that. You know what one of the nicest, if not the nicest thing that was said to me on our 25th anniversary here of being here at Macedonia was a lady came up to me, and I would have never, ever known this. She said, Greg, I want to thank you. She said, you challenged me to get out of my comfort zone. I was so shy. I was so just turned in. And says, you put it to me by putting me in positions that I needed to speak up. I needed to do things myself. And I do that now. And I haven't regretted it. To me, that was one of the nicest things that was said to me over that, just thinking back over the 25 years, that I'd helped somebody come through that. Is it risk? Yes. Is it trouble? Yes. Is there a possibility of some failure? Yes. But just obey. Just obey. Take the risk. Obey. I don't think I've ever told you this story, but this is probably 20 years ago now. We went whitewater rafting, and Kathy Peel went with us. And I didn't know Kathy very well at that time. And if you've ever been whitewater rafting, they put you on a bus, take you up the river away from everything. Then they read you the paper that you've got to sign, and they scare you so bad, you think you've got about a 10% chance of surviving this thing, you know. And Kathy Peel came to me and looked, she goes, I can't do this. And I just made this up. I said, you got to do it, Kathy. There's no way to get back down the river, you know. So I don't know if they would have drove her back down. I don't know. But we did it. We get out. The first person that comes up to me, we get out of the river, she goes, let's do it again. You know, and that's just how it's going to be. That's just how it's going to be to you when we get out of that comfort zone and you speak to people, and there's some time when you're going to look and they're being baptized and you're just going to love it, and you're going to say, let's do it again. Let's repeat this over and over again. Confession is not a one-time thing. We're to go through our lives confessing Christ everywhere we go. Do any of you know the weight of regret? Does anybody know how much regret weighs? You can't put a pound on it, can you? But it's awful hard to carry. And we do not want this. You do not want to carry the weight of regret, of I wish I would have said something. I wish I would have reached out to them. In Mark chapter 1, there's a story of a man who came to Jesus who had leprosy. He begs Jesus to heal him. And of course, Jesus does. You remember this story. Jesus heals him. But then Jesus does one of the strangest things. After he's healed this man of leprosy, he says, don't tell anybody what I did for you. How many guesses do you need to figure out what the man did? He told everybody he came in contact with. Now, I'm not proponing that we are condoning disobeying God. But here's a man who was told, don't tell, and he couldn't contain himself. And we're told to tell, and we have to have it dragged out of us. Will you go? Will you go? And here's the second, here's the third one here that I want to say. I've skipped all over the place, haven't I? I got you messed up there, don't I? Okay, Beth. All right, we're going to do the best we can here. Will you go so they can hear? That's back on verse 14 again. So don't look at the screen. This isn't Beth's fault. This is me. I skipped the whole page. Got it? Will you go so they can hear? Look at verse 14. It says, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? Will you go so they can hear? See the dots? Somebody's got to go so they can hear. Because we can't believe unless we hear. We can't make a decision unless we believe. We can't make an action unless we're ready to make an action to believe on that. You see, and that's the question here. I know, you see, Paul is talking about salvation here. I know that. But isn't there some things that you want people to hear? Isn't there? Don't you know somebody, a dot that you can, a blank that you can fill in that says, I want you to become a Christian so bad. But you're thinking, I just wish they knew the peace that I know. And you think back where Jesus said, peace I bring you, peace I give you. Not as the world gives, but I give you peace. And you look at friends of yours or family members, or you just see the world in general, and you see people who are so in such turmoil, and their lives are falling apart, and you see their marriages in shambles, and you see the relationships with kids, and you see all of these things happening, and there are people, and you go, I just want you to know. I want you to know that there's a peace that comes with Christ. I want you to know that you don't have to live this way, that you don't have to struggle through all of this, that you don't have to be ruled by sin and one bad decision after another bad decision after another bad decision. Can't you think of somebody that you want to tell that to? That your heart just breaks for? That you want to tell about this peace? And so that's that second question. Will you go so they can hear? Because that's a step. That's an indispensable step that they must hear about Jesus came to save all. Now I'm going to go to the third one here. The third one here. Will you go so they can hear, so God can save? Will you go so they can hear, so God can save? And that's going to jump all the way back to Romans 10:13. Because that's what I said, we're working backwards here. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. This is where we're great. When we start connecting dots, this is the ultimate. This is the dot that we want to get to, because really we're doing nothing to save people. We're just trying to connect dots to get them to this place so God can save them. I go back to what I said at the beginning. Salvation is for every person, period. Salvation is for everyone. But just listen to this, please. But just because Jesus died to save all people does not mean all people are saved. Just because Jesus died to save all people does not mean all people are saved. People have to hear it. People have to process it. They have to believe that the message is true. They have to make a confession that I am a sinner, lost in my sins, and today I confess that before God, and I believe in Him, and I turn my life over to Him, and I want to commit my life to, I accept the salvation, the terms of the salvation of Jesus Christ. Nowhere does the New Testament, does Jesus teach it, does Paul preach it? Nowhere does faith exist without obedience. So just to say Jesus died for all, so all people died for all people, that's true, but it doesn't mean all people are saved. We have to respond, and that's why it is so important that we talk about, will you go? So they can hear, have that opportunity to believe, confess, process, make a commitment, so God can save. Our job is just simply to help them get there so God can do the heavy work that He can save. Now, I want to go right back to the very beginning. I told you we're moving backwards, this whole thing. Go back to the very beginning. What happened before this? What happened before this beautiful picture that we've all enjoyed and watched and seen, and tears flow down our cheeks when we see somebody make this entrance into a new life with Jesus Christ? If it was on a video, could you run it back? Could you run it back and you'd see that maybe a person that we didn't even know, that had been a picture of somebody on their knees for years? I've been praying for you for years that this would happen. Would you see that there was somebody who loved them, loved this person that's being baptized, loved them when they were disobedient, when they were outside of Christ and they were arrogant in their sin, and you still loved them? And you challenged them with some grace and some truth? Could you go back and find that person who challenged you, who finally, he says, you don't have to live this way. Jesus died for you. I wish you would make it. I wish you would follow Him. Can I tell you something about my Jesus? Could you find somebody, as we ran the video back, of somebody just started a casual conversation, was friends with them, and who knows, may have started with an invitation to church, and they began to feel like part of a family and wanted to learn more, and they learned and said, this is what's for me. This is what I need to do. Maybe you're looking at your own baptism video, and you're going, yeah, that was my grandpa that did that for me. That was my neighbor. That was my best friend. That was that lady at church who always talked to me. Now, don't you want that for somebody else? If you had it for you, don't you want that for somebody else? Fill in the blank.